think in our current setting where people are deconstructing, the one thing I would want people who are deconstructing to know to their core is if you wandered off because you weren't getting what you needed for sustenance, that was a good reason to wander off and go get a drink.
Welcome to Ancient Jesus Future Faith. I'm one of your hosts, Tana Sheaver, and I am here with Sarah Minardi.
Hello.
And Don Sheaver.
Hey.
And today we are going to be talking about the parable of the lost sheep. Now, if you would like an overview of parables in general, I recommend you go back and listen to our episode on parables. I don't have it pulled up at the moment, but I think it was episode 15. And that's where we talk about a bigger overview of all of the parables. But today we're going to be talking about the parable of the lost sheep. And to get us started, I'm going to read from Luke 15, 1 through 7 is the parable of the lost sheep. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Then Jesus told them this parable. Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them. Doesn't he leave the 99 in the open country and go after the lost sheep until he finds it? And when he finds it, he joyfully puts it on his shoulders and goes home. Then he calls his friends and neighbors together and says, "Rejoice with me, I have found my lost sheep." I tell you that in the same way, there will be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. So that was the Luke version.
Can I tell a quick story?
Of course.
About this parable and something that is oh so Don. If you know me, maybe you don't yet from the podcast, but I was speaking someplace and it was in a situation in which there were several speakers in a row and we didn't know what the other speakers were going to talk about. And I was supposed to speak right after lunch, and the person that spoke right before lunch spoke on this parable. Mm-hmm. So I went to the person who was in charge of everything and said, "I have a problem."
Oh, no.
And they're like, "What's that?" I said, "I'm speaking on the same passage." And they're like, "Oh, that's no problem." And I said, "Yeah, except for I'm going to say people teach this wrong, and I was going to use that exact way that person taught it as an example of how people misteach this."
Yikes.
Yeah, yikes. So the person in charge was like, "You know what? I think it'll be fine. Just, keep like..."
Maybe not to the person who taught, but...
But here's the thing. Tana, you were there. You just obviously don't remember.
Yeah.
But the person that did give the thing, after I taught it, came up to me and was like, "That was so good. Thank you for that." And I was like, "No, you don't get to also be nice." So anyhow, this parable, there's a fondness for me with this parable that actually has very little to do with the parable itself. It's just
that experience.
Oh my gosh. I was like beside myself. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was like, why didn't I even think that might be a possibility? But, all of us had the option of any place in the Bible. So the fact
You both picked that.
And this specific, because there's it's told three different ways.
Things, yeah.
In this, and of course they only spoke on the lost sheep, and I was only going to talk about the lost sheep. And yeah, so that was, oops.
Was this the gathering also where a gentleman called his wife stalwart?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I thought.
And this, we were at this thing, and at different moments we were asked to talk about our spouse. And share something about our spouse, and both spouses did it, right? And the one gentleman referred to his spouse as stalwart, and everyone was kind of like, "That's
romantic."
Romantic, yes.
Yeah.
That is the first word that came to all of our.
He spoke first, because if he had to follow what you said, then Don was like, "Let me tell you about my wife," and it was like, I wish I remembered what you said exactly, but it was like the most beautiful, he made me sound like I was the most amazing person in the world.
Well, you are.
And and people were like tearing up, and like men were coming up to him afterwards like, man, you're making it worse for us here. Anyway.
Yeah,
So-
too bad you couldn't record that and like play that every
I
morning. and tell
know.
us
I
to
should have recorded it.
I'll tell you those things every morning.
do. Yeah. I text Don sometimes, then I'm like, I need encouragement. Tell me nice things.
Yeah, it's so easy. You two are. It's so easy
He is
with
very
you two
good at that. He is
to
very
tell you guys nice things because you are so worthy of all those things.
Well, thank you.
So, on to the passage.
Yes.
Sarah, how have you heard this passage taught?
I think like an emphasis on finding the lost, and the lost being applied to like people who are either like not going to church regularly or like whatever this denomination has decided are the things that qualify somebody being lost, like that we should be like out there trying to find those people.
Yeah, that's the way I've heard it mostly.
Yeah, kind of like an evangelism sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, that was the thing I was unteaching. But I think that is the most common way to read this. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of jump in and just take a little bit of control here to ask a few questions.
Yeah, go for it.
At least at the beginning.
Yeah.
So if you are thinking about this passage and trying to think of it differently than it being about evangelism and saving the lost, is there any clue that you could see in the first few verses, first several verses, that might make you realize, oh wait, maybe this is about something different than that?
Different than like actual sheep?
No, different than like it being a story about evangelism and
Oh.
saving the lost.
Because the preface where it says the Pharisees and scribes were complaining, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them.
Yeah. Yep. And then Jesus starts to tell the parable. And how does he begin the parable? Very first phrase.
Suppose one of you has 100 sheep and loses one of them?
Right. So who is the parable about and who's at fault?
A shepherd who loses a sheep.
Yes.
Yeah.
This has nothing to do with the sheep that wandered off.
Yes.
Yeah, it doesn't say. And one of them wandered off.
Right. One of the irresponsible sheep, knowing better,
That is
wandered off into the
interesting.
wilderness.
That is very interesting.
Instead, the parable begins with Jesus being like, okay, listen, you're upset, you're griping, you're complaining about me hanging out with people that you identify as being unworthy of my presence, of our presence. Well, let me tell you this parable. You are a shepherd, right? And that is a common phrase for leadership within Israel, where the people being a shepherd. And Jesus says, you are a shepherd and you lost a sheep.
Yeah.
What do you do if you are a good shepherd? If you're a good shepherd, what is your instinct to do? Go and find that sheep.
Yeah.
Go and find that sheep and bring them back into the flock, into safety.
Yeah.
And you right now are complaining because there are lost sheep sitting around this table that are being brought back into the flock. You should be a good shepherd.
So what you're saying is that not a lot has changed. Because I feel like that's today, you know.
Yeah, say more about that.
So I just feel like one of my critiques of the modern evangelical church is that it is very much this, the Pharisees here saying this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. It's like a blaming, a pointing away, and like those are sinners, and very much see someone who is not in their estimation a good Christian or whatever, that person has fallen away. So they've wandered off from the flock, rather than seeing that something the evangelical church did drove them away.
Right.
Like they lost the people.
Yeah.
It is very much a you must do as I say, and you must follow all of these things. And if you don't, you're the one who's in the wrong, regardless of what we're saying and doing. You know what I mean? Right. So it's almost like if the shepherd, the shepherd's not doing a good job of tending to the sheep, like blaming the sheep for being lost seems silly.
Yeah. Yeah. And this becomes, if you read it through the lens, say we imagine that the way I'm presenting this is plausible, that's the way we should read it or could read it. Mm-hmm. It also makes it way less interesting for a pastor to teach on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. So suppose I've lost someone.
So look around the room and who's not here.
Yeah.
And now let's suppose if I was a good shepherd, I'd be going out and finding them and seeing what it is that they need and caring for them and bringing them back in. But I'm not. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. See, this is a beautiful tie-in with the idea of mobile sanctuaries.
Mm-hmm.
One of the podcasts we just recorded.
Yes.
Yeah.
That we should be mobile sanctuaries if we're going out and we're trying to create salvation and safety for people.
Yeah.
That's very different than creating a building and just waiting for people to come back to you. And if they leave, that's their fault. They're sinners. They're not ready to listen to what we have to say or whatever.
Yeah. And all the money and effort that goes in. And I think it ties into the, I have two thoughts going, so they're kind of like colliding. But the idea that we've mentioned probably before, that attendance is not a prerequisite for care. Mm-hmm. That's one of Don's sayings, that like you being at the church, you don't have to be there all the time, regularly, or at all to be worthy and deserving of care. But then also like building the perfect buildings and the perfect marketing and the perfect, trying to get all these things right in the hopes that people will like come to your church, as opposed to going out and doing the difficult work of actually building relationship,
right?
And getting to know people, and getting to know people for the joy of getting to know people, not with an end goal in mind.
Yeah.
Outside of their own safety.
Right. Because you're going to return the sheep because, you want to make sure the sheep is taken care of and has their needs met and all that.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the feedback so far, but any other thoughts about the way this kind of changes, like some of that reading, if we take what I said and think it's plausible, that the topic is not the sheep that's lost. Mm-hmm. The topic is the shepherd that goes and gets them, if they're a good shepherd. Mm-hmm. How does that change for you the way then that you would feel this about your own self, about the way that we think about others and our responsibility?
So in Luke anyway, the parables are stacked, lost sheep, lost coin, lost son. Mm-hmm. And the imagery in each of those is of the person rejoicing when they find the lost thing.
Yeah. And an active seeking.
I was going to say that, and then I was like, I don't think the father really
he does.
actively...
He sits and watches and the moment his son comes up over the edge of the hill, he runs to him. So he is actively looking out for him.
Yeah, I was just thinking he didn't like trek off to try to find him. But and that... So it's interesting because the lost sheep and the son, like those are mammals with... the ability to walk away. The coin doesn't have the ability to walk away on its own. So that's,
right.
It's interesting because now even the way they're described, the pericopes the version I'm reading is the parable of the lost, rather than the parable of the irresponsible shepherd.
Yes.
Or the parable of the loving father.
Right.
Or, whatever. And that, I think that also says a lot about how we interpret these.
You are 100% correct. I hadn't considered that, but yes,
Gold star.
the naming of them is very much puts the subject on the thing that is lost,
Right.
as opposed to the thing that or the entity that lost it.
And I think that for me anyway, over the years has definitely, well, and also how the way it's been taught to me outside of your teaching, Don, has very much been like, oh, this lost thing was then found. And it's very passive. Whereas if you focus on the seeker, that's very active. And I can see then how a lot of people would just make the correlation then with evangelism. Like, well, it just means we should be going out, you know. But I feel like there's nuance there. And probably because I'm not a fan of how evangelism is typically done, you know?
Sure.
Because it doesn't feel like a seeking out for love and returning someone to the fold. It feels more like it's laden with judgment.
And here's the thing with the parable of the sheep, too, that I think is significant. The sheep does not repent.
Right.
And just wander back into the fold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're retrieved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's significant too.
And your point to the coin not being able to walk away just puts more onus on the woman who lost it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's even more about the seeker then.
Yeah.
And and also there's the rejoicing. Everyone ends with rejoicing.
Yeah.
And that feels different too.
Yeah. I did read too that, I think we've talked about how Pharisees get a bad rap sometimes. And I did read that Pharisees did share a concern for finding the lost. Some of them might have frowned upon Jesus' open fellowship, like with people, but others would have recognized the value of personal involvement to restore people to Torah and would have celebrated if somebody came to repentance. So
yeah, this and Sarah, to that point, I think it's really, really important. I personally hold that Jesus was a Pharisee. Jesus was a member of the Pharisaic party. Everything Jesus taught, everything Jesus did fit within Phariseeism. But just like if you were to look at a political party, there's going to be different understandings even within the political party. There's going to be further right, further left, more moderate in both parties in the US. And that even within Phariseeism, there was a large swath, there was a spectrum of views, and Jesus was critiquing Phariseeism from within Phariseeism. And so, yeah, to me, Jesus is representative of what you just said, of some Pharisees would have very much sided with Jesus. Well, because Jesus is a Pharisee, in my opinion.
yeah. And I think a step further that it's possible that, he uses the word repentance, and that might, like, if, like having read that, it just made me think that the Pharisees, even if they didn't agree with how he was going about it, would have still felt joy over somebody who repented.
Absolutely.
And that was like the tension they were trying to figure out. Is he going about this in the right way? Is what he's doing okay? Does the end justify the means?
Right. There's the fear that what Jesus is doing is condoning behavior.
Yeah.
As opposed to calling it out and calling for repentance. And we still see that wrestling match in the church.
Right.
Like that if you accept everyone, then you're condoning their behavior, and we can't do that. So it's better to not accept everyone so as to not condone certain behaviors. And Jesus seems to hold the perspective of, no, everyone deserves safety, as we often talk about here, a space in which they are welcomed and cared for. And then we trust the goodness of God and the influence of those around them, that it will shape them into something closer to what God has in mind for them.
Yeah.
So it just seems like over and over, Jesus is saving people, reaching out to people, and not just, like faithful Jewish people, but like people who are typically shunned. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, Jesus is the fulfillment of Torah, and Jesus is the example we're all supposed to follow. So how did we get to this point where it's more about judging people who are not doing things properly than trying to welcome them and seek them out and provide sanctuary for them?
Yeah.
I'd say Plato. Plato begins the introduction of dualism, spirit versus flesh. In the Hebraic mind, the spirit and flesh were the same. You couldn't separate the two. And so Platonism introduces this idea that our spirit is always fighting against the flesh. We see that reinforced by Paul, which makes sense because Paul is talking to Gentiles who have been influenced by Platonism. And so he uses similar language about fighting the flesh. The problem is we read that and then assume that is part of Paul's theology, as opposed to this is the way he's communicating a concept to a Gentile. And so I would say then the other part that Platonism brings in that causes us a lot of problem is Platonism, as it begins to become the methodology used to interpret the Bible. So at that time, just the Hebrew Bible, not the New Testament specifically, but the Hebrew text by the time of Jesus, was that everything was allegory. So everything was just spiritual terms, spiritual concepts, right? And that when you read the Bible, the Exodus is about spiritual things. And the one thing that comes with allegory, particularly within Platonism, is that it takes a unique individual to be able to see the allegory. So it becomes a hidden secret that only a handful of people are going to understand, which then puts the power in the few to be the ones to say, this is what that passage means, or this is what it's being called to. And by moving it to spiritual as opposed to physical, it gives us permission to reduce our actions and make it more about study than about actions. And I think, Sarah, you have some thoughts about that from some conversations we had versus the wrestling with study versus action.
Yeah. I mean, that was like a common tension in that time too among the Jewish scholars, is like, is it more honorable to be studying Torah or acting on Torah, learning Torah, or practicing it? And that seems to like come to play with this parable. Did you want me to go?
Yeah, please
on
keep
that?
going. No, I would love for you to.
Well, I mean, when I was thinking about that idea and this passage, I somehow got into like Hosea and Micah both mention, like the Micah passage that we're very familiar with, love mercy, act justly, walk humbly type of thing. But this idea we see in the Old Testament prophets of, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And it was one of those things where I never like stopped to really think about it, because I'm like, oh, that sounds weird because it sounds like two things against each other. Like, God doesn't desire sacrifice. Well, then like, why are there so many sacrifices?
Why command it in the first place?
Yeah. And like they were like mutually exclusive. But then it dawned on me that like God clearly, the sacrifices are in the Torah, but the sacrifices are just the tool. And when the prophets are saying that God desires mercy, they're saying that's the end goal that God wants to see, is the mercy. And the reason we make sacrifices is in the hopes that it will turn our hearts towards mercy, that we'll realize that I forget all the specific sacrifices, but I do something that the Torah requires a sacrifice, and now I have to pay the price for it, with the actual physicality of offering an animal. Like, that's all very physical and tangible, and but God saying that I don't desire to sacrifice doesn't mean he doesn't want the sacrifices done, but that that's not his ultimate goal, is just to see animals die. And he just likes that kind of thing. No, he's desiring the mercy, that it's like the sacrifices are like the tool to get there. And it kind of helps me also understand, there's a phrase about the Sabbath that, what is it? Man is not made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is made for man. because I always struggled with that too. And I'm like, I'm sure it's true, but like even just getting my mind around it, like what does it actually mean? But I think this helps me understand it, that like, it's not that God desires that like everybody stop for 24 hours and do certain things, and that's what he's looking for. He desires the benefits that come from Sabbath, and he hopes that by observing Sabbath that we as his beloved children will get that joy, that peace, all those wonderful things that come from Sabbath. And the Sabbath is just a tool to help us get there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like we don't tell our kids to not eat just candy, but eat some other things that are good for you, because we hate things that are tasty. Right? It's that there's benefit that comes from eating healthy, even if it doesn't taste as good as that Twix bar, right?
Yeah.
Ooh, Twix.
I knew I knew that would get a reaction from Tana.
Yeah, and I thought of a parallel with my kids, that like if I'm asking them to clean, you know, I desire, yes, that it be clean, but like the goal, like I more desire that they have like a helpful heart or an awareness that like these are the things we have to do to keep an orderly house as they like grow up. Like my desire is different than just like I'm getting pleasure out of watching
Like,
you.
I want it clean.
Sweep. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to tell Malcolm that, you know, it wasn't just that we preferred that his room was clean. It was also that, you know, he would complain that he couldn't find something. And we're like, well, it's probably buried under all the clothes on the floor somewhere. Or maybe he would forget about like a piece of food he left somewhere, and then that attracts ants or whatever. Yeah.
So something that was said earlier that I think kind of brings all of this also a little bit more together, and I'm really interested in you guys' thoughts, is that, Tana, you had made the comment about evangelicalism, that it like kind of blames people for walking away type thing, that they're at fault. So one of the things I don't think many of us growing up in the church are familiar with, well, I'd say most of us are not familiar with Jewish midrashes. But this parable is almost hand in hand with a midrash. So I'm going to kick it over to you two to see if either of you possibly know the midrash, what midrash this is played off of.
No.
So there's a midrash about Moses. And Moses, when he was shepherding sheep in the wilderness, right around the time of seeing the burning bush, it says that while he was shepherding, and I'm saying this from memory, so forgive me for those of you that know this inside and out, that I might not say it quite right, but that when he was out shepherding, he recognized, or he noticed, that one of the sheep had left the flock. And so he goes and he starts searching for the sheep, and he's looking and he's looking and he's looking. And finally he comes across the sheep. And when he catches up to the sheep is drinking from a puddle. And Moses' reaction to it was, oh, you were thirsty. And I didn't realize it. And you left to go get something to drink. Now, for some reason, that's making me very emotional. But Moses doesn't get mad at the sheep. You get the impression reading the Midrash that maybe it leaves room that Moses is kind of irritated about this sheep wandering off, and that there's a moment of him accepting rebuke in this moment when he sees, oh, you wandered off because you were thirsty, not because you were obstinate, not because you were irresponsible, not because of X, Y, Z, but because I didn't care for you the way you needed to be cared for. And so Moses allows the sheep to finish drinking and then carries the sheep back to the flock. And it says at that moment is when God knew that Moses was the right person to lead Israel out of Egypt. So I think that that's, when I have that story in my mind and I read this parable, it really hits home even harder.
Yeah.
Right? And I would imagine that at least there is some reasonableness to think that these Pharisees knew that midrash also.
Oh, okay.
And when Jesus starts telling this story, I imagine that the Pharisees were like, oh, yeah, I know how this one goes.
Yeah.
So any thoughts about that? To me, that's so...
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I would think that, I mean, this discussion is making me think this for myself, but I'm also hoping other Christians would do this, is to first look within to see why someone wandered off. And I think that's possibly applicable not just like in the larger church and people leaving it, but also maybe in our own relationships,
Yeah.
Things like that. And, it's not 100% always going to be your fault, but I think it's something that is worth pondering, because I think our first instinct is just to put the blame on the lost thing,
Yeah.
Yeah, the blame on the person who walked away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do think it's also helpful for us to recognize that right now, probably during the great deconstruction, as people are abandoning the church at some of the highest rates of the church's history, that what the church has done is made it out that the problem is the people leaving.
Right.
That they no longer want to hold the Bible as sacred. They no longer want to deal with the consequences of sin. Whatever diatribe and things you've heard thrown at people who right now, in this era of Christianity, are starting to wrestle with their long-held beliefs. It's rarely that leadership in the church pauses and say, oh, they were just thirsty.
Yeah.
And we weren't providing water that was suitable, right? And that they had to wander off because what the church was providing, what the shepherd was providing, was not sustainable for them. And I think that is, to me, the power of this parable in our current setting. I think there's value in it throughout history. I think that and all that, but I think in our current setting where people are deconstructing, the one thing I would want people who are deconstructing to know to their core is if you wandered off because you weren't getting what you needed to be for sustenance, that was a good reason to wander off and go get a drink. It's sad to me that there is not enough people out searching the countryside for sheep next to puddles.
Or even saying, okay, that sheep wandered off because it was thirsty. Maybe we should offer it some water. Maybe water should be a part of our,
Exactly. Yeah.
The other thing I find really interesting is what you were saying about Platonism, because the division of spirit and flesh makes me also think about the sort of focus on the individual that is prevalent in today's Christianity, and it's interesting because the individualism seeped in from like American ideals, and so it's these outside influences that have shaped these ways of interpreting these stories. And I just find that very, very interesting because the people who, today during the Great Deconstruction are saying, all these people are leaving the church because they don't want to actually believe the Bible.
Yeah, they don't want to be held accountable or whatever.
Right. But what they're actually rejecting is this version that has been overlaid with a whole bunch of secular secular stuff, and they'll be like, oh, they're just steeped in secularism and they want, you know what I mean? Like it's just kind of a funny.
Yeah, when in reality this parable is saying people have wandered away because the shepherds have been pretty shitty shepherds.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not like thirsty, like we need to start another program or we need to like build
that's
community.
so good.
It's
Yeah.
like people are thirsty for being able to like ask questions and to get deeper answers. And people are not satisfied with pat answers that just come with like
Right.
joining a community and we just suddenly like agree all these things. People want to know more and they want to be able to have those discussions. That's what I think people are thirsty for.
I think you're right.
Not just
Yeah.
that another program or Bible study or fancy service, you know, it's not about that.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe that's just like in the big picture, you know, like so many of these mega churches popping up over however many years it's been of mega churches and the building up of like the lights and the fog and the perfect
Flying
worship.
drummers.
Yeah. And these big buildings and all these things. And it was good for a while and it seemed like the right thing to do. And then like, but now people are just like seeing through it. Cause it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so now we've got all the things. So now, and just now people are like realizing that like there's more.
Because that wasn't a fundamental change. It was
Right.
dressing. It was
It's like, yeah, covering things up, like,
yeah.
or like,
It was just trying to make it more appealing to in a sort of entertainment and cultural kind of way, not actually addressing the theological issues that people were.
yeah. Or like even, you know, and I don't even think it was necessarily intentional, but like wanting like worship to be a certain way to evoke an emotional response,
Right.
either by playing with
Oh,
the
I think it was
lighting
Yeah, I
intentional.
absolutely believe that was
or, you
intentional.
know, like the smoke and all that stuff and like the trained musicians. And I'm a trained musician, you're a trained musician, you know, like I think there's
I'm a train wreck of a musician.
there's like a certain, and like being involved with the church years ago, I remember like there being people who wanted to sing in front of the church and the pastor's like, well, they don't sound that good, you know? And it's like, it's a tough line to walk, especially like in a small church.
Yeah.
But like to not, you know, like I feel like even that, like when things are like so perfect that like eventually people just start to see like the holes in it, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I don't know if I should say this. Like the, you know, the neighborhoods where all the houses look the same.
Yeah.
At least we've got them here in Toledo. Like
Yeah.
they're built by the same builder and they're like
Yeah.
perfectly constructed and they're even like same color shades and things like that.
Yeah.
It's like when you drive through one of those neighborhoods and you see somebody's mailbox tipped over. Did I use this example in another podcast?
I don't think so.
But you see somebody's like mailbox tipped over, then it pops right out to you. Like if you drive around my neighborhood, you don't know because like every house is different and like colorful
Yeah.
and there's like so much going on, but there's
Yeah.
like a beauty to that,
Yeah.
to it not being perfect.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
there's a beauty to like somebody who is a terrible singer, just like worshiping God. Like if a terrible singer was truly having an experience of worship, I think it would be beautiful to see.
We have a friend who was, I haven't really spoken much to them in several years, so I doubt they're listening to this and it maybe wouldn't even know it was them I was talking about. But they were not what one would call a gifted singer. And I could listen to them sing worship all day.
I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about, and that's exactly who popped into my mind when
Yeah.
Sarah was talking.
Because-
I remember, and I'm picky.
You are picky. But yeah, and that individual, you could feel them feeling
Yeah.
what they were singing,
Yeah.
and it didn't matter.
Yeah, and actually the choreographer who's I'm working on a musical right now, and the choreographer who's working with us, I was sharing, we had to find the right versions of things, and she's like, oh, I found a video on YouTube, she's like, I used to live in Florida right next to that school that did that. And she's like, you know, like they had all the money and they had the talent and the sets were huge and everything was perfect. But she's like, when I went there, I had to like buy M&Ms to chew on because I would just get so bored because there was no heart in it.
It goes back to I desire mercy, not perfect sacrifice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And to me, even like as a director, as a teacher, it's like to get children to like perform at a certain level, like that's like the end goal. But like, what about all the rehearsals that went up to this? Like, how did you treat the students that you were working with because theater can be very stressful.
Yeah.
Performing can be very stressful.
Yeah.
And it's like notorious, I think, in the performing arts world that for people to be strict and rude and harsh. And like, I just lived my whole life as a music teacher trying to combat that like we can get there with kindness and with grace and with like respecting people. And I started a homeschool musical because I'm like, I want to start a musical where kids don't get yelled at when they're at rehearsal and prove to people that these things can happen without
harshness.
Yeah.
I seriously have lasting trauma from that and from my high school because our high school choir director and musical director was just so harsh.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of anxiety around music, which I love, because of that experience. So, yeah.
And yeah, that's just like my life song.
So thank you for.
I mean, I seriously started it because like my daughter didn't want to go back and do a production that she'd done before because she got yelled at for making an innocent mistake of putting her hands in her pockets, probably like the first day she had costumes, and not realizing that like, you know, she wasn't supposed to put her hands in her pockets. And, you know, in the defense of that director, I've been there. It's very stressful. A lot of things are going on. Maybe, and my daughter's a little sensitive. Maybe the director just raised her voice and my daughter took it as
as like yelling.
you know, so not saying anything against that director, but like, okay, so if there needs to be a musical where somebody's not going to yell, then I'm going to make it happen.
Yeah.
So I'm doing 2 musicals now, and that's why.
Nice.
That's awesome.
Well, let me ask you guys, how would you, like, I'm trying to think about one of the things I like to do when I'm thinking about parables, and I'm trying to think about what is profound about this, because we had mentioned in our parable episode that if there's not something that shocks you, then you're probably not reading it correctly. Right?
Yeah.
Which is why I think it is shocking that this is about the Pharisees. Like the Pharisees are not expecting to be on the bludgeoning end of this parable.
Right.
How do you think we should, if we were trying to communicate this to a church or to a community, how would we tell this story to that community? Like how would we phrase this? How, like not just repeat the parable, but how would we say this is a value that Scripture has? I know we've kind of done that because we've talked about how we haven't done it, right? But how would we talk about doing this?
That's a good question that I'm not sure I know how to answer.
I mean, the first thing that pops to my mind was like, and I don't even know if this would apply, but like, is to be careful about language that's used about people who we're classifying as lost. Like, how are those people talked about behind closed doors, in boardrooms, in planning rooms of churches? Because, you know, I think churches want to reach the lost, but like what language are they using around that might need adjusting?
Yeah, there seems to be, it feels like there's this big return to sort of like the Jonathan Edwards way of preaching the, was it sinners in the hands of an angry God? Is that, you know, the very fire and brimstone, like it feels like that's the kind of language that is being perpetuated in sort of like evangelical churches. And that doesn't feel like the kind of language that is inviting and welcoming back to people.
Yeah.
But that's what's celebrated right now.
Yeah, and I think like voices around the table too, to like, you know, as teachers and leaders, to have that humility to like bring young people around the table and really try to understand their experience, instead of just thinking that because we're older and we think we've got it figured out, we're just going to tell you like the way it is.
You know, I think, I don't actually know if we're answering your question, but
It doesn't matter. It's good stuff.
But I think one of the, I keep thinking of this idea. So thinking about the shepherd, they have responsibility for this sheep. But when they go and find it, it does say he calls his friends and neighbors and says, "Rejoice with me. I have found my lost sheep." And that to me does not come across as like, when I think of a shepherd and we talk about shepherding in Christianity and everything, that feels nurturing.
Yeah.
But a lot of what we get now is authoritarian.
Yes.
And so I think that's one of the things I would try to drive home to people is that we need to be somebody who is a leader in the church in particular needs to be caring and seeking out people, and like you said, inviting other voices to the table and seeking to do things in community rather than holding themselves up as such an authority that anything different than what you think, any question to you is too much of a challenge to your authority for you to withstand.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, and when everything is presented as such like authority, like top-down teaching and things like that, then it creates like, or at least for me personally, maybe there's other personalities who wouldn't feel this, that like, you know, most of the churches I've walked away with, I've just like walked away without like a word, because to me it's like they're not going to want to know.
Yeah.
yeah.
That wasn't entirely true. I can think of an example where that's not true. But yeah, it's like not an atmosphere where they want feedback or they want that. And maybe like stronger personalities might just be like, well, you're going to hear it anyway, but not me.
I think another element here in this parable that gets shifted a little bit when we change who is the person being accused is the 99 sheep that are left to fend for themselves. Because there's safety in those numbers, right? The 99 sheep are much safer together than the one out by itself. And I think that if we think about pastors or we think about church or faith leaders now, that the obsession is with the 99.
Yeah.
And it's not worth going after the one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to be careful here because some of this language is even triggering for me talking about it, in that going after the one as if like this some individual out there needs to repent or needs to do something. The whole heart of this is not about anything else other than returning that sheep back to the safety of the flock.
Yeah.
And in the church today, a lot of people are not safe in the flock.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. You look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I have two things.
Yeah, please.
I actually did read that like it's quite possible that with a flock this size that probably there were like under shepherds that because sometimes that abandoning aspect gets brought up in this parable a lot, but that there was probably like other shepherds that were with if it was of a size this size. But what popped in my head as you're talking about this and thinking back to the introduction of like Jesus eating with sinners is that like in this parable, a sheep is a sheep.
Yes.
A sheep is a sheep. Whereas in the accusation, we've put labels on people and separated them.
Yes.
That these are the sinners and these are the people that you shouldn't be hanging around. But like, they're just sheep. They're people too.
Right.
They're people who will benefit from being restored.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah.
And there's just the connotation that lost has become is so uncomfortable to me.
Yeah, I was thinking about that too. Like it feels like one of those Christianized words.
Absolutely.
And I don't know in this time period what word they would have used, but you know, as I was trying to like think outside the box in this parable, I'm like, when they heard the word lost, did they hold more of a physicality to it that you're just physically like, you know, like not in the right place? Because I feel like growing up in different churches, lost just automatically goes to like salvation.
Yeah.
And it's so like tightly tied. But I think we do see in the Old Testament, like maybe in the Psalms or the prophets, like mentions of being lost, and we definitely see mentions of shepherding. But it was really hard for me to parse out like what lens am I applying to that word lost that isn't necessarily there.
Yeah, I think it has to do with belonging, right? I think there are lots of people in this world who are not Christian or not people of faith, and they're not lost.
Yeah.
Because there was the belonging that they have is with a different shepherd. And that's okay. Whereas there are people who have experienced trauma in the flock of the faithful, whether it's because a need was unfulfilled or because they were marginalized in some way, and found that they were better off fending for themselves. The prodigal son, right? Felt that it was better off to fend for themselves elsewhere. And that is the lost there is always the fault of the shepherd, the woman, and the father, which we don't let like the parable of the prodigal son to be the fault of the father, but it is.
I was wondering about that when we were mentioning all three. So
Yeah.
I want to hear what because I couldn't get there right away.
The father's at fault because the father had to know what was going to happen. The father had to have some sense of what was it that caused this disruption. It's clear that the brothers don't get along. It's clear that there is anger and frustration and jealousy and unhealth in the relationship within the household. And that the younger son imagines that life would be better outside the flock. And the father, I would argue, in that story, has not necessarily done enough to, help fix that. And there are some times where it's just the reality is nothing's going to stop it. And maybe you can make the case for that with the prodigal son. But the father continues to search.
Yeah.
I think that when we think about the onus being upon the one that was responsible for creating safety within the flock, the onus was on the one that was responsible for ensuring that all the needs of the flock were taken care of. That changes what lost means. Lost means that the person, if we're thinking about this in human terms, that the person is absent from the flock because of the failure of the shepherd.
Yeah.
The shepherd lost them. The sheep did not get lost. Right? The text literally says, you lost a sheep.
Yeah.
You lost them. The sheep is only lost because of your actions. And so we make the lost about someone made a decision to not believe in God, or they made a decision to not do something. That's not the implication in this passage. The implication in this passage is you, the person responsible for creating a safe environment, salvation,
Yeah.
failed.
Yeah.
And because of your failure, that entity is lost. And you are responsible to go and find that lost sheep that is lost due to nothing of their behavior, but due to yours, and return them.
Yeah, and it's almost like the lost isn't attached to the item as much as it's attached to the person who lost it. And instead of it is a descriptor of like the situation they're in, but it's only a descriptor of the situation they're in because of the
Yes.
Yeah, like it's like a very like a shift, that sheep is only lost in reference to the shepherd.
Yes.
That sheep is not a lost, terrible person doesn't need to wear all that shame.
Correct.
The only reason you can describe the sheep is lost is because it's separated from the shepherd. The only reason that coin is lost is because it's separated from
The woman.
the woman. Yeah. So it's like that loss gets so attached to the animal, the item, the son, but it's only lost because it's disconnected from that,
Yes.
which is really different.
Very different. And we would do well to speak in those terms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're at time, and that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up. Any final thoughts from either of you?
No, I think that was it.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah, I feel like that was kind of a good place to end.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. I don't know if I'm going to remember all the things that I normally list here, so feel free to jump in and fill in if I didn't. In between podcasts, you can find us on YouTube. We have live streams every Monday and Thursday. We put up other videos and shorts on there. If you want to read more about Ancient Jesus Future Faith in general, you can go to ajffpodcast.com. That goes directly to our podcast page, and then you can go out from there to see what else we have on offer. And if you want to get in touch with us, info@ancientjesusfuturefaith.com. Find us we're on like pretty much every social. And I think that covers it all.
If you'd like to actually financially support us.
I always forget this part.
Which is fine, because that's okay. This is the most awkward part, actually.
Yeah, right.
But if you would like like us financially, we would be grateful. buymeacoffee.com/AJFF if you would like to do that.
Yep. All right. Good. I'm glad you remember, because I always forget. All right. So yeah, thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
See ya.